Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning report for Monday, 14 July 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike today, and let's get started off with our domestic income. So, Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Marty McCarty said in an interview over the weekend that the FDA may fast track new drugs from companies that he says if they equalize drug costs between U.S. and European markets. And he said that some of these drug companies that make these price adjustments could also obtain what's called a national priority voucher through a new FDA program announced last month. President Donald Trump said he is going to make a major statement on Russia later today. And Trump is currently scheduled to meet with NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte today in Washington, D.C. And Trump did announce over the weekend that the U.S. is going to send an additional Patriot missile system and other military aid to Ukraine. Rio Tinto, which is a British-Australian multinational mining company, said that it has a strong desire to invest in U.S. copper mining, and this is after the Trump administration announced plans for a 50% copper tariff. And Rio Tinto estimates that its Resolution copper mine project near Superior, Arizona, which is currently under development and I believe is in the permitting stage, could provide up to 40 billion tons of copper over the next 40 years. And then the Kerr County Sheriff's Office ordered volunteers to suspend searches for victims over the weekend due to new flash flood warnings from the National Weather Service. And the National Weather Service did issue these flash flood warnings yesterday and Saturday, and they warned that severe storms in the area could drop 3 to 6 inches of rain per hour. And let's bring Jared on. If you could take us through the global sit rep, please.
Absolutely. The Taiwanese Straits Exchange Foundation is reporting that Taiwanese businesses have been rapidly decreasing their investments in mainland China over the past 10-ish years. Mainland investments dropped from 83% of businesses in 2010 down to 11.4% in 2023, then down again to 7.5% in 2024, and so far only 2.7% have bothered to invest in mainland China. And the foundation reports an undefined increase in Taiwanese international investments at the same time, particularly for production. Kind of staying in Taiwan, the Senate National Defense Authorization Act currently strongly encourages the Secretary of Defense to invite Taiwan's Navy to the biannual Rim of the Pacific exercise, or RIMPAC. If the Secretary does not, he must provide a notification explanation to Congress per this. Now, the earliest this could take effect is next year. That's when the next RIMPAC is, and they would have to actually pass this bill. So there is plenty of time for this to actually happen. Moving over to the Middle East, Israeli officials are calling to expand Israel's claims over the West Bank. A mayor of an Israeli settlement over there currently claims that, quote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu knows that extending sovereignty is the correct policy and President Trump should support it. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's former deputy communications director claims that Israel must, quote, right the historic wrong and reassert full civil and security control over Joseph's tomb in Nablus. So I do expect that there's going to be quite a bit of this. This is especially in light of the fact that Iran, they no longer are considering a top threat for the moment. Down in Panama, the deputy administrator of the Panama Maritime Authority, or AMP, said that the AMP has no update on the CK Hutchison port sale to BlackRock, but he will remain vigilant because the transaction term actually expires later this month on the 27th. So hopefully we'll have an update on that around the end of the month here. Then moving back over to Korea, Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, told Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that North Korea is, quote, ready to unconditionally support and encourage all measures taken by the Russian leadership as regards to tackling the root cause of the Ukrainian crisis. Meanwhile, South Korea claims that North Korea has supplied more than 12 million artillery shells to Russia since they began their partnership.
All right, let's move on to our In Focus today. I'm sorry, we have protests for today. We are tracking 41 for 14 July. And moving on to our In Focus for today. So over the weekend, MarketWatch published an article from veteran economic journalist Kenneth Raposa. He's now an analyst for the Center for a Prosperous America. And in this article, he argued that basically the free trade era is over. And according to Raposa, America is moving toward a more managed trade. And this has some implications for the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, which is up for renewal in 2026. And Raposa's argument is that America Inc. 2.0 is going to be founded on managed trade, regionalized supply chains, and tariff-backed fiscal policy. And we can already see some of the positive impacts of Trump's attempt to reshape this global trade environment. There have been, I think we started talking about last year, some multinationals and corporations overseas were anticipating Trump's tariffs and began investing in U.S.-based production, including Hyundai, which has committed to investing $21 billion in U.S. production. GM announced a $4 billion investment in production facilities. And according to industrial sourcing platform Thomas, 41% of global automakers said they want to reshore manufacturing to the U.S. starting this year. And 85% of companies they asked said they plan to shift purchasing to U.S. domestic producers. And 40% said they're likely to add U.S. producers to their supply chains over the next 12 months. However, on the surface level, the Trump administration has said the goal of Trump's economic statecraft, or macro grand strategy, as Michael Every calls it, is to close these trade deficits and boost domestic basically reindustrialize the United States. But I think while that and protecting the U.S. from a China shock 2.0 that is already hitting foreign economies, I think the Trump administration is trying to stave off this looming public debt crisis that we are facing. So political economist Albert Marco, he argues that the only viable path forward for the U.S. to address this debt crisis is to extract value from the rest of the world without triggering domestic inflation. And he says that this will take the form of tariffs and, I think more importantly, other monetary mechanisms that he says would transfer real wealth from foreign economies to the United States. These other monetary mechanisms I think he's talking about, and as finance and economics expert Michael Pettis argues, would be tariffs on foreign capital inflows in the United States, which I think this is the next step after these tariffs on imported goods. And Pettis argues that foreign capital inflows are a debilitating curse that actually boosts the value of the U.S. dollar, making exports more expensive and imports cheaper, fosters excessive financialization because of all of this capital inflow in the United States, which is buying up real estate, buying up treasuries and bonds and going into the market, and actually hollows out the U.S. industrial base. And Pettis' argument for a money tariff may have some influence on three key figures within the Trump administration. That's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Council of Economic Advisors Chair Stephen Miron, and Vice President J.D. Vance. So there's a financial analyst named Michael McNair who argues that Bessent's, Miron's, and Vance's ultimate goal is not just to shore up these trade imbalances, but actually to restructure the entire global trade and finance system to remove these distorted foreign capital inflows. And he's called this the new Bretton Woods gambit, or other media, financial media figures have called it the Mar-a-Lago Accord. The idea would be to restructure or attempt to restructure U.S. debt and stave off this debt crisis while maintaining the dollar's reserve currency status. So I think first, this bolsters the theory, something that I think that Mike put forward a few months ago, that the Trump administration is responding to changing geopolitical and economic conditions rather than the Trump administration creating global economic chaos with no coherent grand strategy. And I think the Biden administration likely recognized the problem the United States is facing too. But as I said at the beginning of the year, I think they were taking only piecemeal steps and didn't really have a coherent grand strategic approach to this problem. And the limited sanctions and export curbs that the Biden administration implemented only really hurt U.S. manufacturers while allowing China to continue making technology advances. And if Pettis is correct, I think China has that 4-year period also allowed China to continue pushing excess savings into the United States, or excess capital, potentially exacerbating this debt crisis we might be facing. And second, I went back and read through a document written by Miron in November 2024, before he was appointed in the Trump administration. And in that document, he says that the U.S. will likely push foreign partners and allies to shoulder some of that financial and industrial burden due to the U.S. being the reserve currency. And that financial and industrial burden has driven the U.S. debt up while simultaneously gutting the U.S. defense industrial base. And so what I think is happening here, and the next step from the Trump administration, specifically from Bessemer and an advanced faction within the Trump administration, is likely an attempt to improve U.S. and financial economic position without entirely breaking the current global system, and by taxing these inflows, or what's called a money tariff. And the idea is to prevent the U.S. from falling victim to the Triffin dilemma. All right, moving on to our next item. The Pentagon purchased a 15% share of a California rare earth minerals mine owned by MP Materials, which makes the Department of Defense the largest single shareholder in the company. I did see a recent S&P Global report that showed that rare earth minerals declined. Imports from China declined by 32.1% due to export curbs that we've talked about over the last year. And S&P Global also expects that increased tariffs on those imports from China and other rare earth mineral producers could cause significant supply chain disruptions. I think this is a significant advancement of the DoD's effort to build what they called a mine-to-magnet supply chain for rare earth minerals. And this was actually announced in the 2024 National Defense Industrial Strategy. And the DoD is starting to implement this industrial strategy by putting public capital into key supply chains to spur development that otherwise might not receive private capital investment, likely with the goal of returning shares to the market after sufficient industrial development. And I think the Trump administration could use the same strategy to make up for the U.S. shortfall in refining capacity, which China still controls about 90% of that global market. All right, Jared, if you want to come on and take us through your item for the day.
Absolutely. So, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Elbridge Colby is reportedly pressuring allies in the Asian Pacific, the two that were called out were Japan and Australia, to clarify where they stand on defending Taiwan if China attacks, which we previously discussed here. One thing that was interesting, Australia's Minister for the Defense Industry refused to preemptively commit because, quote, we don't discuss hypotheticals and the decision to commit Australian troops to a conflict will be made by the government of the day, which theoretically would be here in about 18 months. Now, Australia's Chief of Joint Operations had a slightly different take on it. Speaking on the Talisman Sabre exercise, he said that China can interpret what 19 friends, allies, and partners wanting to operate together means to them, which, as we've discussed here, basically from what I'm saying, the Talisman Sabre exercise is not directed at China, but it appears to be a massive interoperability exercise that you would need to counter any kind of Chinese action on Taiwan. It's a phenomenal training ground there. But getting on to why it matters, Australia is way behind the ball on realigning against China, but is already pretty well committed to it by stating that the status quo is key to their national security and their national security strategy. Now, Australia has a pretty significant critical minerals reserves. They've signaled in the quadrilateral dialogue that they are open to becoming a processing hub for those materials, and they're a very important potential staging point for allied forces against China, which if they do not commit to a defense of Taiwan, then that is very likely to not be used. Like, you don't allow troops, you would become a belligerent if you allow troops to go from the U.S. to Australia to Taiwan, which, as you can see on the map here, there's a fair amount of U.S. presence in Australia already. Now, the U.S. and its allies, particularly the core anti-China coalition here, the U.S., India, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, all of them need Australia. They are a critical player, and they need them fully on side if they intend to oppose China militarily and economically. I think economically, I'd probably need to focus on a bit more because, again, Australia is a major mining point and potentially a major processing point as it sits well outside of most of China's reach.
All right. Well, before we move on to questions and answers, I did just want to go back to the in focus. I wanted to explain really quickly the mechanism that Pettis says is driving this debt through this foreign capital inflow. So basically, his argument is that it creates a pool of cheap money inside of the United States that these other countries like China have to get rid of in order to keep their production economy afloat. and it does a few things. One, it disincentivizes domestic capital investment because it drives the value of the U.S. dollar up. So companies do not spend their dollars on their current savings on building more factories or more processing plants or more production. And the second thing it does is that since the federal government has to make up for that lost domestic consumption demand from that deindustrialization, they spend more to make up for that demand, which the cheap foreign capital provides cheap borrowing. And I think in his argument, the federal government gets addicted to that cheap money and goes into runaway deficit spending. And I think that's really what's behind his argument for why the next, or really behind my argument, the next step for the Trump administration is to start taxing those inflows to disincentivize that cheap money from coming into the United States, because that one does remove that cheap money that the government is continuing to borrow to spend during this huge deficit, and two, then creates room for companies in the United States to invest what they have into reindustrializing the United States. All right, let's move on to questions and answers. So what's our first question for the day, Jared? This one we're going to save for Mike.
There are probably a couple of them that we're going to save for Mike here.
All right. Late last week's ICE protest, could the one-armed protester firing shots have been trying to create an overreaction by federal law enforcement, creating martyrs for their cause? Well, that's possible. That is a typical strategy used by insurgent groups or terrorist organizations. I don't want to label these people as a terrorist organization, but that is a typical strategy used to invite overreaction because that builds public support. All right, next question, please. What are your thoughts on Trump's desire for the Treasury Secretary to also assume the role of Federal Reserve Chairman? Well, I think Trump has said that he wants Powell out, and Scott Bessent is a very smart guy, and I think he would probably be perfectly fine as chair of the Federal Reserve. But I'm sure Mike will probably have a lot more to say about that. All right. Any idea when any trade deals will be announced? The ag commodity markets are dying. You're going to start seeing farms go bankrupt if they sell at a loss. They can't hold out much longer. I think right now the deadline for these trade deals before the reciprocal tariffs go into effect is August 1st. So that'll probably sometime between then and now, we'll probably get more announcement of trade deals or any other movement on these bilateral trade deals between the United States and other countries.
Yeah. Being that this is ag community, isn't, if I remember right, we primarily ship to China. That one, I don't know if there's actually going to be a deal there, but there are actually plenty of deals in the works, particularly from Japan. I saw South Korea was still working on theirs. Japan I saw from Japanese media that they were softening their stance as well. So
yeah, I think Trump's trying to sell them American rice. So there's China was a major, or at least was a major consumer of U.S. ag commodities. Yeah. I think they have shifted a lot of that to Brazil over the last year,
particularly meat. Yes, and you got to keep in mind that China does not benefit by continuing to buy from us. So they're incentivized to, just take this and run with it.
Well, yeah, and that's also I think the thinking behind the DoD buying a major share of that mining company, actually, because if we get a trade deal with China where they turn off those export curbs for rare earth minerals, they could just put them back on at any time in the future in the United States. It's the same reason why the United States wants to build these supply chains for these critical minerals.
Yep.
All right, next question, please. RE interest rates fed. Why do we pay our own bank's interest on our national debt? They are making money on it and the loans they process with it. That's probably a Mike question. Bad web. We have two issues of resistance. One in dim states against which are defined in federal law and or rule the state by fiat. The other against the Fed, TDS, but both are against the government. Continue. Do you see these two factions combining or fighting each other? Well, I think right now the Democratic Party is going through a transition. are beginning a transition to see who is going to take control of the national level party. You have the more moderate, what would have been called blue dog Democrats versus the more progressive Democrats, especially ones that align with groups like the Democratic Socialists of America. I think looking at the right, over the last couple of months, the Democratic Party, at least on the surface, has presented a much more unified stance against the Trump administration. I think eventually they are going to have to fight over who is going to have more control of that. And, we saw some of the backlash against Schumer at the beginning of the year over passing that continuing resolution. And I think the next thing I'm looking out for is how the Democrats treat these must-pass spending bills that have to be passed by the 30th of September to avert a government shutdown or a partial government shutdown, because they've been signaling that they're willing to disrupt some of these must-pass bills in order to get some kind of concessions from congressional Republicans, or at least put on a face of resisting the Trump administration. And I think that Axios article that Mike covered last week, where Democrat lawmakers were talking anonymously, I think they probably are a little freaked out by the stances of the Democratic base, especially the ones that are telling them they need to be willing to get shot to resist the Trump administration and mass deportations. All right. Last question. Bad Wabbit, with the recent uptick in language from the administration, do you see them training people to think of the left as the anarchist insurrectionist? It seems like they're escalating also. I think part of the issue with the Trump administration is getting mass deportations done is a major issue for for Trump's base. It's also, for the most part, an issue that favors Trump, and I think they're trying to balance the public appearance of that, because right now Democrats are largely messaging off of that, as we saw over the weekend in California, where they raided that marijuana farm before DHS announced that they had rescued, I think it was 8 unaccompanied illegal immigrant minors who were working there. A lot of the California state officials have come out to oppose it. So right now there's just a messaging war going on. And it is escalating, I think, especially as we found out with those Democrats speaking anonymously about how their constituents, or people, their voter base wants them to escalate. All right, well, that will do it for questions today. We'll be back with you tomorrow at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.